Hi, I'm Miss Amber, and I'm here for the English 11B live lesson. I'm going over the third lesson in the English 11B class today, which is Elements of Modernism. There's a lot to cover, so I'm going to try to just jump right in. If there are any questions about lessons that are not this one and this recording gets interrupted, don't worry, I'll re-record something that goes through everything all the way through, but no one's here right now, so we're just gonna get started with the lesson. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Alrighty. So starting off on slide 5, just right off the bat, elements of modernism. So basically, this slide talks about archetypes. It gives you a rundown of what they are. Archetypes are common symbols, characters, and plots that you see in literature. So these are things that have been covered in other English classes. But archetypes are, like I said, common symbols and types of characters. So whenever you think, oh, that's the comic relief character, or that's the hero, so of course he's going to be able to do blah, blah, blah. You're referencing an archetype. It's a type of character, a role in a story that shows up very often, so often that we can categorize other characters and stuff that we haven't seen, sometimes just based on visual cues. For example, for anyone that watches anime, you know who the main character is. Usually they're the person with the brightest hair, the most unique features. You know, they're going to go on a journey to try to better themselves. Similarly, if you're into horror movies, you know that the innocent heroine is a big archetype in horror films. Someone who just gets pulled into the plot for no reason, but ends up having to build like the grit and the strength to push through and survive until the end of the film. And there are other types of roles like this, like when you consider like the wise old wizard sort of thing, you can see that character in lots of places. Most shows or media that have magic in them have like an old man that tries to teach the main character some of their tricks. A subset of the wise old man is the mentor, which is usually someone who actually raises the main character. And usually, you know that they're going to die at some point to give the main character motivation to actually push through and complete their journey. All of those things are archetypes. If you can point at a type of story or a type of character or even a type of place and say, oh, well, I can sort of figure out what's going to happen based on the guidelines that are being followed here, then we're talking about an archetype. So this class is just gonna, this lesson is gonna be about some of the older archetypes because you know stories were not always the same as they are now, so they had to start somewhere, and there are older archetypes that have new versions, revamped versions, and things like that. So they start off with telling you about the quest. They're talking about plots at the moment, and that's a big focus for this lesson because there are other lessons that go over types of characters. So they talk to you about the fact that psychologist Carl Jung and mythologist Joseph Campbell studied a lot of different cultures and stories. And they found that the quest plot is an example of one that repeats pretty much anywhere, even in cultures that haven't had contact with each other. There's a lot of overlap in terms of how the quest happens. So then they give you some points about what the quest plot archetype is like. So you get a hero, and the main hero goes on a journey. Usually it's pretty dangerous to find an object or to reach a goal. And while they are on their journey, they usually are accompanied by one or more people. Sometimes they start off by themselves and pick up people along the way. Sometimes they start off with a friend, and those two people pick up people along the way. Sometimes the character is just with a group of people who's supposed to protect them. They're all under the same umbrella. It's all the quest archetype. So they usually have to beat monsters or foes and solve puzzles. And there are other common elements like temptations, journey to the underworld. There's usually a big final set of tests where the tension is really high and you're just not sure if the main character is good enough, but of course they are. And usually the story ends with them going like finally being able to go home since they finished up everything. So they give you examples of these different types of archetypes and which stories use them. And I would take time to write this down. You don't have to write down every single thing here, but they give you a lot of good information. They explain what the archetypes are. They tell you that you can use it for plots. They give you the example of one with the quest. And then they tell you stuff about the quest plot, the elements of it that you might want to remember. And the examples they give you are Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. That's the picture that's there on the right. And Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. So then they tell you about variations. So all of these archetypes become so popular that people do certain twists. And when those twists or changes also become popular, they become their own archetypes. So they give you an example of that here with the Voyage and Return. The Voyage and Return archetype is a variation or a change to the quest archetype. So in this one, basically a big event results in the main character of the story, having to leave home. And the whole story is about the character having to get back home, how they get back home instead of going out to solve a goal. Usually in these stories, completing the quest wasn't hard, or the story fast forwards past where the main character has completed the goal. And it focuses just on the character fighting to get home. Everything in the world is trying to stop them from getting home. So there are some similarities that this has to the quest archetype just because they're similar. So stuff that they encounter during the journey influence the hero's personality. That's where all the development happens. So usually if you've got, for example, a character like Hercules, getting to the place where he could train wasn't super hard, at least in the Disney film. Being able to be strong and have those strengths, even in the original mythology, he was already strong. He was a demigod. So it wasn't so much about him getting strong and being able to beat a big bad. He was trying to get let back into Olympus, and he had to do all of these quests to be able to do that. So that's an example of the Voyage and Return archetype. Actually meeting the goal, getting the item, those things aren't hard. Once they get it, and very like Indiana Jones style, that's when everything starts trying to stop them from moving forward after they already accomplished the goal. And they give you a couple examples of these as well. Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe and The Wizard of Oz. So Wizard of Oz, everyone usually is familiar with that. You know, Dorothy gets swept away into the fantasy land, and she's trying to get home. The entire main point of the journey is her attempting to get back home, not her accomplishing anything. Like, she has to do things to get home, but she's not doing things just to do them to be famous or to get strong. She's doing them just to get back. Okay, so slide 7 is one of these things that has mini slides. And I always tell students to write these down. It's just absolutely important that you actually write these down. Because if they give you a slide like this with all these little smaller points on here, you're definitely going to need to know about them. Luckily, the important things to get out of these paragraphs is the definition of the archetype that they're trying to give you and the example of the story that they give you. So still read through these, but in terms of writing them down, for example, for Rags to Riches, it tells you the Rags to Riches archetype starts with a main character who is ordinary or poor, and they're transformed or changed by a sequence of events into someone with a high social standing and wealth. So they go through the plot for Cinderella, because that's a big example of the Rags to Riches trope. But you don't have to write down the entire story of Cinderella in your notes. Just make sure you include that the example of Rags to Riches that they give you in the lesson is Cinderella. So for tragedy, the main character is overcome with a desire for power that ultimately ends in death. So they go through and give you an example of the Scarlet Letter. Basically, a man gives birth to a daughter out of, a woman gives birth to a daughter out of wedlock and is forced to wear a scarlet letter A as a sign of her adultery. And the person she's pregnant by is her father. And even though she's humiliated, she tries to protect him because he's the minister of the church. But eventually, the minister reveals the truth to the townspeople and then dies. And they give you another example, which is The Great Gatsby, which is a story where Jay Gatsby is driven to make money after growing up poor. Unfortunately, he falls in love with a married woman, and basically the story is him trying to get together with her and them doing that kind of will they or won't they dance. But the story is pretty tragic. It ends with Daisy hits and kills a woman in Gatsby's car. And Daisy basically lies to the woman's husband that she hit to let him know, or at least to manipulate him into thinking that Gatsby was driving. So even though he was in love with her, like she was still looking out for herself. So in this case, aspiring to power can be anything that the main character thinks will give them power. Gatsby was in love with Daisy, so he figured he'd have everything he could ever want if he could just be together with her. And she was just not willing to give herself up. She felt like it was her or him, and she chose herself. So for comedies, the plot of a comedy involves misunderstandings through a story that happen over and over until things get resolved at the end. So any sort of like rom-com, where two characters are supposed to be getting together, but they keep bumping into each other in weird ways. The example that they give you for this one is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. So the long story short is that Tom Sawyer and his friend Huckleberry Finn are always getting into trouble. They're known for basically breaking all the rules and doing bad things. They end up seeing someone robbing a grave and committing murder. And no one believes them because they're so troublesome. So at some point, they do some other stuff because it is a book of adventures. There's like 6 or 7 adventures in there. They lead people in their town to think that they died, and then they show up at their own funeral. They go into a cave and find hidden treasure. And Tom tries to win over the affections of a girl in their neighborhood. And it's hard because of the reputation that he has with Huckleberry Finn. And then there's some tension between Huckleberry and Tom because he's like, oh, so you want to be a proper man now, kind of thing. But Tom and Becky get trapped in a cave, and he proves that his adventures with Huckleberry, have helped him learn skills that can help them get out of situations like that. So he ends up helping her out of the cave, saving the day. And things work out. So the next one is Rebirth. Rebirth is a form of tragedy. So that's important to remember. Rebirth is a type of tragedy. And it's when someone or something, either concretely, so I mean it happens literally, or figuratively, dies and is reborn. So it's not always literal. Dying and being reborn can be having a life changing accident or experience. It can be meeting someone who makes you want to change and be different. It can be you going on a short adventure that changes your mind about something important. It can actually be that you have a near death experience and you do actually die for a few seconds, and it leads you to change how life is happening. All of those things count as death or rebirth. It's about the idea of you changing to become something different than you were before. So the example that they give you here is Snow White. And I know it seems like a lot of these examples are silly because they're really old stories, but entertaining people with books was basically the same as what movies do now. And I mean, to a certain extent, books still offer that to people. So it's just really interesting to know that all of these used to happen even back then. We all know the story of Snow White. She ended up biting the poison apple and she goes to sleep forever. She falls into an endless sleep that can only be awoken by true love's first kiss. So she gets kissed by the prince, and he takes her back to his palace, and Snow White basically wakes up, and they're able to live happily ever after. Now, the example of Snow White that they give you here is the original fairy tale, not the Disney version that I just gave you the um, summary of. So in the original version, the apple was actually stuck in Snow White's throat, and that's why she was forced to sleep. So the original story has a little more, like detail there, but it's basically the same story. It's still rebirth. And the very last one we have here is overcoming the monster. So this plot features a hero that specifically has to fight a monster or supernatural being before defeating it and saving the world. And this can be in the form of a hero being born to defeat something and having to go through a journey and fight with, oh, is this what I want to do? And it can also be a hero, an unlikely hero, stumbling upon a monster that's keeping them trapped somewhere. So the example that they give you here is Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack sells his cow for magic beans. Everybody laughs at him. They think they're ridiculous, but they grow into a giant beanstalk. He actually climbs up it and finds a giant who's living in the clouds in a castle. And the giant has a hen that lays golden eggs. Jack has to steal the hen to save his family from poverty. And he manages to climb down the beanstalk really fast and chop it down before the giant can get down. So when the beanstalk falls over, the giant dies, and he gets to keep the golden hen. So in this case, the giant would be the monster, especially since the giant wouldn't let him have the hen. They had to basically fight for it. Okay. Now, this next slide talks about how archetypes can change over time, which is something I mentioned earlier. So not every story falls into the archetypes that we went over. There are other types of archetypes. They just went over some of the major ones that have been around for a very long time. And they don't always incorporate every single detail. Some people do plot twists. Some people try to break down plots to give commentary on them. Why do we always write stories like this? Why can't the ending be something different? Sometimes we have humorous parodies of these. And sometimes they just change over time to fit what people view as normal now. So for example, instead of rags to riches, like back a long time ago, rags to riches was kind of like the dream. People basically used to hope that they would stumble upon a situation that would suddenly make them rich. And because of short lifespans at the time, it was actually possible. You could have, at least if you were, American of European descent, you could have some old relative, die and leave you an inheritance, or you could strike gold while hiking out west or find some oil or something like that, because the times were different. Things weren't the same as they are now. The country wasn't populated, it wasn't settled as much. So a modern version of the rags to riches plot is a coming of age story, which instead of becoming rich and wealthy and having that fortunate situation happen to you, you go through things that force you to mature emotionally and mentally instead of acquiring money. There are some examples of movies where you do actually inherit money. So for example, Princess Diaries is one of those. Literally, her parents passed away on some weird, silly plot stuff. But she ends up literally becoming a princess and then immediately having to deal with the fact that money does not stop you from having to go through problems. So you get more modern versions of these archetypes like that. And one of the things that they give you as an example is Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. That is still an older example, but it still works. I would still write down these examples because there may be questions on the mastery test that basically say which of these represents the blank archetype, or which one of these is another version of the rags to riches archetype, for example. Okay, the second half of this lesson is on the development of mood. So just as a reminder, mood is pretty much the way that a text feels. It is the way that a text, excuse me, it is the way that a text feels, and it is the way that you think of a scene in your head. So when you're watching like a movie and you can see that the setting is super gloomy, there's fog everywhere, shapes seem to be coming out of the fog, it's very quiet except for like crackling branches and things like that. That's how movies set a mood, and it's easier to do with pictures. But in a book, you have to use words to basically put the person who's reading in the mood. And that's literally what mood refers to. It's the way that you use language to let people know how they're supposed to feel in the story. So this slide just lets you know that sometimes mood is also used to foreshadow. So for example, if things are really tense, if in a movie there's a certain type of music that's coming up, you can get hints as to what the mood is supposed to be. And sometimes the mood can change. You might end up with a character in a book who interrupts the mood that's currently going on because they don't know everything that's happening or something like that. So they basically give you the rundown of what developing mood is like. How do you develop effective mood? So like if you don't know how to develop it correctly, your mood will be all over the place and people won't know how they're supposed to feel when you are or when they're reading your story. But they give you a list of things that people use to do good mood portrayals in their stories. So diction, they list diction here. So such as diction, imagery, sentence length, and sound. So they say, for example, read the following excerpt from poet Carl Sandburg's fantastical children's story, How the Animals Lost Their Tails and Got Them Back, Traveling from Philadelphia to Medicine Hat. So this excerpt says, it was easy enough for the rabbit who had long ears and no tail at all except for a white thumb of cotton. But it was hard for the yellow flongboo who at night lights up his house in a hollow tree with his fire yellow torch of a tail. It is hard for the yellow flongboo to lose this tail because it lights up his way when he sneaks at night on the prairie, sneaking on the flangwares, the hippers, and the hangias. So good to eat. Sandburg's diction gives you simple words in combination with nonsense words. So the nonsense words are obviously the ones that you were like, what to? While I was reading this. So the flangwares, the hippers, the hangias, the flongboo. But the fact that he uses those gives you a hint that this is a very fantastical children's story. And he can do that. He can set that mood for the story just by putting that word in there. You might spend a second saying, what the heck is a flongboo? And then try to look it up and realize it's actually not a thing. But if you were reading this to a child who was like 3 or 4, they wouldn't even bother asking if it's a real word or not. It would just sound fun to them. They'd probably be trying to repeat it. And that's the sort of mood that he wants to set with his poetry. Now, this next slide goes straight into sound devices since we're talking about using silly words and things like that. So they basically go over the sound devices that are used in poetry. And once again, I want to point out that there is actually a section in the English concept summaries about nonsense words and poetry and sound related rhetorical devices. So if you're having trouble with this lesson, you can always go to those and take a look at these. But on the lesson, they talk about alliteration, assonance, and consonants. And those are also covered in the English concept summaries. You might have to go back to the 10th or the 9th grade levels to find them, but they are there. They talk specifically about nonsense words. So it combines the rational and irrational to create a playful blend of language and meaning that incorporate humor and fantasy, just like what we just read. Literary nonsense was originally aimed at young readers, and one of its main purposes was to introduce sound patterns to children. So people learn sounds based on what they hear when they're children. So a lot of these books, like the children's books that you read, have those silly words in them on purpose so that children can actually hear the combination of those letters and understand a little better how to read things when they actually start practicing reading. So I give you some more examples from Carl Sandburg's poetry here, and just some of his nonsense words, flummies, whisters, and they give you an explanation here of how it sounds and how it comes together from both of these excerpts. So just take a little time to go through that. It's very straightforward. So we get to more of his stuff. Carl Sandburg is one of the authors you're gonna end up reading excerpts from. And they give you his background here. He was born to Swedish immigrants. They tell you about what influenced him to actually start writing. Um, and then they go into his actual excerpts. So he give you the strategy for reading, for translating his nonsense words. So they give you basically the example of the word that we already encountered, flummy whisters. And it says, when reading nonsense words, think about what the words could mean and make inferences. So that means they want you to use the information around that word as context clues about the underlying word they represent. You can use a table to keep track of this information, and they give you the table in the different sections. So this is the sentence that has the nonsense word in it. What part of speech is it? The potential references. It might be a type of animal, and the reason to create an imaginary type of animal that sings. So he's usually using these words to create imaginary sounds, animals, things, and they just want you to try to keep track of that so that you're not too confused while you're reading. Then they give you the analysis. So they break it down just in case you're not sure about what you read over. That's what the analysis is here for. It's pretty straightforward, and I don't think you'll have any issues with it. So they go over some of the excerpts and point out some important information about it. And that's about it. So the important thing here is that the nonsense words and sound devices are big parts of modernism. That's the entire point of going into mood and sound and everything in this part of the lesson. These are all things that are present in the modernist era of writing. Before now, people weren't really trying to really make up their own words, not to be silly. Shakespeare made up a lot of words, but he made up those words from things that were already well known or references that were made specifically just to be able to articulate like a picture to people. He threw a lot of words together using words that people already use. These are literally nonsense words. They're not based on anything. And that's something that is really only present in modernism. So it says here, Sandburg places animals with nonsense names in real locations such as Philadelphia. He also shows the animals in meetings that are bureaucratic and formal as real life meetings. So his use of nonsense words adds to the reader's sense of being out of sync with society. And then the last sentence, the last section here is just focus on language. So they give you different prefixes here. Those are parts of words that come at the beginning. And then what their meaning is and examples of words that have them. So the important reason why you should try to remember some of these is because if you come across a word that you don't know, if you can at least understand the different parts that make up the word, you can guess at what the meaning is without having to look it up. So all those times you've taken mastery tests in the past and you're like, I don't know what this word is, but I don't feel like looking it up. If you can at least learn what these different parts of words mean and are associated with, you'll have a lot better time with guessing at what a word could mean just based on its parts. All right, I'm going to stop sharing because that's about it. If you have any issues with reading through the reading selections, please book a tutoring session with me or Miss Kathy Vahovic. You can also try to book one with Jennifer Papp. If you have a quick question that needs to be answered, you can email the English department at english@atsedu.net. And you can also just contact your mentor. You can also drop into the help desk, which is run from 11 to 3 p.m., 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. And we can answer quick questions. If you don't have a quick question, you know it's going to take a tutoring session, just book one. You can book most tutoring sessions for at least a half hour. Alrighty, other than that, this is Miss Amber signing off. Good luck with your English courses, and I'll see you next week.